Hello, this is Cheryl Krieger, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 20th issue of the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the headlines, Trump says UK stupidity on Chagos Islands justifies Greenland demands. The United Kingdom agreed to grant Mauritius sovereignty over the archipelago, one of whose islands hosts a UK-US military base. By Steve Hendricks, London. The president was fine with it a year ago. Now it's great stupidity. President Donald Trump told British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in February that he was on board with a deal the United Kingdom had reached with the island nation of Mauritius over ownership of the Chagos Archipelago, a remote string of atolls in the Indian Ocean, including Diego Garcia, home to a base for U.S. bomber aircraft. I have a feeling it is going to work out very well, Trump said to cameras in an amicable Oval Office meeting with Starmer. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hailed the historic agreement. On Tuesday, however, Trump seized on the deal to justify his effort to seize Greenland, describing the UK agreement as a disqualifying example of international idiocy. Trump's quest for Greenland, the vast Arctic territory long controlled by Denmark, a NATO ally, has become a bitter, high-stakes transatlantic contretemps, surging from fringe strategic fancy to a Category 5 geopolitical hurricane. With Trump displaying aggressive territorial ambitions, he highlighted the Chagos Islands Agreement, which grants the nation of Mauritius sovereignty over the contested archipelago, but guarantees Britain and the United States a 99-year lock on a joint airbase there as a contemptible example of total weakness. Shockingly, our brilliant NATO ally, the United Kingdom, is currently planning to give away the island of Diego Garcia, the site of a vital U.S. military base, to Mauritius, Trump posted Tuesday on Truth Social. The UK giving away extremely important land is an act of great stupidity and is another in a very long line of national security reasons why Greenland has to be acquired. Trump's sharp reversal and astonishing rebuke of the UK, which is often described as America's closest ally, managed to stupefy British officials who are mostly numbed to serial shocks from this White House. Trump's expansionist moves, from taking control of Venezuela to risking the transatlantic alliance in his grab for Greenland, contrasts sharply with Britain's recent history of unwinding imperial legacies from Hong Kong to Africa. The contrast could not be more stark between the United Kingdom negotiating a deal to implement international law and President Trump being unable to understand why any country would comply with the law at the global level when it goes against its immediate interest, said Mark Weller, a law professor at Cambridge University and head of international law at Chatham House, a foreign policy think tank. The United Kingdom has done its very best to absorb the many upsets in the relationship between London and Washington, Weller said. Now we've arrived at a breaking point. With the Greenland episode, the British government is slowly realizing that it needs to stand up for principles. The whiplash criticism delivered as Trump prepared to attend the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, was all the more shocking given London's assiduous work to preserve the special relationship through the tumultuous first year of Trump's second presidency. This included inviting Trump for a historic second state visit with royal trappings. You can certainly say that no one saw this coming, said a person familiar with the deliberations in the Starmer government, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the matter. Keir spent a lot of time getting buy-in from the Trump team on the Chagos Island Agreement and felt it was fairly settled. The timing is particularly awkward for Starmer, the Labour Party Prime Minister, who has made cultivating Trump a centerpiece of his foreign policy despite their ideological differences. Starmer traveled to meet the president at Trump's Turnberry Golf Resort in Scotland in July, enduring criticism for not forcefully condemning what critics called Trump's authoritarian tendencies. Since then, Starmer has carefully calibrated his language on contentious issues, including tariffs and Venezuela. The Prime Minister has been more forceful on Greenland. Starmer's office also pushed back Tuesday on Trump's Chagos Islands blast, but cautiously emphasizing Trump's U-turn on the issue. Officials pointed out that Britain said publicly it would execute the agreement only with U.S. approval. Our position hasn't changed on Diego Garcia or on the treaty that's been signed, a spokesperson told the BBC. The U.S. supports the deal, and the president explicitly recognized its strength last year. Privately, British and European diplomats said they hoped this was another example of Trump's ferocious rhetoric being more spleen venting or negotiation framing than a lasting policy shift. Starmer had no plans to travel to Davos, where the heads of states will be lining up to meet Trump, but the two will talk soon, the person familiar with the government deliberation said. They talk often, this person said. This has been invaluable in the last year. Trump's criticism, however, could mark a widening gap between a president eager to change the map in his favor and a weakening one-time colonizer now doubling down on international law. London's return of Hong Kong to China in 1997 was in fulfillment of treaty terms between the two countries. Government lawmakers advised the past two UK governments that they were at risk of losing access to the Chagos Islands entirely by defying a growing international consensus against British control. The Chagos Islands dispute dates to the final years of Britain's empire. In 1965, as its colony of Mauritius moved toward independence, the UK carved off the Chagos to form the British Indian Ocean Territory, a move later judged unlawful. Britain forcefully removed more than 1,000 residents to clear the way for a joint UK-US military base on the southernmost island, Diego Garcia, which became a key U.S. strategic hub during the Cold War and after. Mauritius challenged British control for decades. In 2019, the International Court of Justice ruled that the UK's continued administration was illegal, and the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly backed Mauritius's claim. The two countries reached an agreement in 2024 to transfer sovereignty to Mauritius while guaranteeing a long-term UK-US access to Diego Garcia under a lease extending into the next century. Britain agreed to pay an average of £1 billion a year for the lease, about $1.35 billion. The negotiations were launched under then Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who later served briefly as a Conservative Prime Minister. But her Tory party, along with hardliners in Washington, have criticized the deal for possibly giving a foothold in the region to China, a key trading partner of Mauritius. Many analysts say those fears are overblown, given the remoteness of the islands and the continued presence of the British and American militaries. I think it was the most strategically clever agreement Britain could have made, said Darshana Baru, a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore. It secures complete operational jurisdiction and continued operations in the same way things have been working for the next 99 years. Trump's sudden fixation on big countries dominating weaker places, such as Greenland, where they have military facilities, is a departure from international norms, Baru said. There are many, many countries that have bases in other nations with just agreements in place, she said. This argument that you must have sovereignty to protect it is new. The immediate future of the Chagos deal remains uncertain. Starmer slowed final negotiations in January 2025 to await the Trump administration's review, and the agreement still requires final parliamentary ratification. Supporters fear that Trump's public opposition could provide cover for the British government to abandon the deal. Doing so would probably expose Britain to international condemnation, undermine its claims to respect international law, and potentially intensify competing claims over other British territories, including with Argentina over the Falkland Islands and with Spain over Gibraltar. Buenos Aires has already cited Britain's willingness to negotiate over Chagos as precedent for talks on the Falklands. The Chagos episode also puts pressure on Britain to choose between alignment with the U.S. and closer integration with Europe, a choice Starmer has sought to avoid. The Prime Minister has pursued a post-Brexit reset with the European Union while maintaining that the U.S. relationship remains paramount. But as Trump's territorial ambitions grow and his attacks on European allies multiply, that balancing act is growing more precarious. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, visiting London, sought to provide reassurance, telling GB News that the U.S.-UK special relationship is critically important, not just for our countries, but, of course, for the entire world. But Johnson, along with the Congress he helps lead, may wield no influence over Trump's territorial appetites. Continuing from the headlines, federal judge moves to replace Lindsay Halligan as U.S. Attorney. A second judge called her continued use of the U.S. Attorney title a charade and threatened discipline for government lawyers in Virginia who keep referring to her that way. By Steve Thompson, Salvador Rizzo, and Jeremy Roebuck. In a pair of extraordinary moves, two federal judges issued court orders Tuesday saying they intend to replace Lindsay Halligan at the helm of a key U.S. Attorney's office in Virginia and threatening disciplinary sanctions for any government lawyer who continues to refer to her as a U.S. Attorney in legal filings. The separate actions by Chief Judge M. Hannah Lauck and Judge David J. Novak, who were nominated by Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump, respectively, signaled a breaking point for the federal bench in the Eastern District of Virginia months after Halligan was disqualified from serving as U.S. Attorney in the high-profile office. The orders intensified a battle playing out nationwide between the executive and judicial branches over how the nation's 93 U.S. attorneys can be appointed for temporary terms without Senate confirmation. And they present new obstacles for Halligan, who had no prosecutorial experience before she was installed in the job, and as she attempts to carry out Trump's directions to levy criminal charges against two of his perceived political foes, former FBI Director James B. Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Lauck directed the court's clerk to publish the U.S. Attorney job posting in local newspapers, asking anyone interested to apply by February 10. The position of United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia is vacant, reads a public notice posted on the court's website Tuesday. Typically, U.S. attorneys are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but federal law empowers the Attorney General to name interim appointees when there is no Senate-confirmed pick. Those interim appointments are limited to 120 days, after which the law empowers a district's federal judges to name a replacement until the Senate confirms a presidential nominee. Several judges had suggested for weeks that Halligan should resign and sharply question her continued use of the U.S. Attorney title after an out-of-district judge, Cameron McGowan Curry, ruled in late November that the Trump administration had used an unlawful maneuver to install Halligan. The orders issued Tuesday marked an escalation, signaling active efforts by the judges to appoint the district's top federal prosecutor under a federal law that gives them the power to do so after an interim U.S. attorney has been in office for 120 days. That order by Lauck was followed hours later with another one from Novak, who raised the threat of disciplinary action for anyone who describes Halligan as the U.S. attorney in legal filings. No matter all of her machinations, Miss Halligan has no legal basis to represent this court that she holds the position, and any such representation going forward can only be described as a false statement made in direct defiance of valid court orders, Novak wrote. In short, this charade of Miss Halligan masquerading as the U.S. State's attorney for this district in direct defiance of binding court orders must come to an end. The Justice Department, Halligan, and a spokesman for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Alexandria, Virginia, did not immediately respond to requests for comment Tuesday. The Trump administration has appealed Curry's ruling, but it never requested a stay, meaning that the rulings disqualifying Halligan remains in effect for now. Nonetheless, she has continued to represent herself as the U.S. Attorney in court filings. This month, Novak ordered Halligan to explain why she continues to use the title, suggesting she may be making false or misleading statements. The Justice Department responded defiantly to that order last week, arguing that Curry's ruling was not binding and that Novak had no authority to strike Halligan's name from the signature block of Justice Department court filings. The response, which accused Novak of making rudimentary legal errors and missing elementary legal principles, was written in a derisive tone unusual for a government lawyer addressing a federal judge. Novak said in response that Halligan's rhetoric was beneath the court's dignity and more suitable for cable news. He said Halligan's continued use of the U.S. Attorney title after Curry's ruling was an affront to the legal system. The court cannot tolerate such obstinance because doing so would undermine the very essence of the rule of law, he wrote in Tuesday's order. If the court were to allow Ms. Halligan and the Department of Justice to pick and choose which orders that they will follow, the same would have to be true for other litigants, and our system of justice would crumble. Halligan's nomination for a full term as U.S. Attorney is pending in the Senate, but it is unlikely to move forward because it lacks support from Virginia's two senators, Mark R. Warner and Tim Kaine, both Democrats, who have emphasized that the Eastern District of Virginia handles a complex portfolio of cases dealing with national security, leaks of classified information, and international terrorism. Halligan is a former insurance lawyer and White House aide. She was a personal lawyer for Trump in the case that special counsel Jack Smith brought against him over alleged mishandling of classified documents that was dismissed. She had no prior experience as a prosecutor. In disqualifying Halligan last fall, Curry ruled that Halligan was never legally appointed to the position of interim U.S. Attorney because the Trump administration had already named someone to that role, Halligan's predecessor, Eric S. Siebert, who served a full 120-day term from January to May 2025. The district judges then unanimously extended Siebert in the role at the Justice Department's request, Novak wrote in his order. But Siebert was forced out in September after declining to seek charges against Comey and James. Career prosecutors had recommended against pursuing the two cases because of insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. Trump then named Halligan, who promptly secured indictments against Comey on allegations that he made false statements to Congress, and James, who was accused of mortgage fraud. Curry tossed both indictments after finding that Halligan was unlawfully appointed. Halligan's 120-day appointment concluded Tuesday, Lauk wrote. Justice Department lawyers maintain that the statute allows for back-to-back interim appointments. But in addition to Curry, at least 5 other federal judges have rejected that argument while ruling on challenges to other Trump U.S. Attorney appointees. In each case, the judges have said that if the Attorney General could legally name a string of interim appointees, there would be no need for an administration to put a nominee up for Senate vote. Still, judges across the country have been cautious in exercising their authority to name replacements for the president's picks. When New Jersey's federal judges named a veteran federal prosecutor to replace then interim U.S. Attorney Alina Habba last summer, the Justice Department fired their pick within hours and undertook a series of legal maneuvers aimed at keeping Habba in the role. Delaware's chief federal judge began soliciting applications this fall to replace Trump's interim pick there, former state GOP chairman Julian Murray. But Murray resigned her post in December before a potential standoff with the administration could come to a head. Judges in other districts have refused to reappoint Trump's interim U.S. attorney picks, but declined to choose replacements. The chief federal judge in Seattle issued an order last week soliciting applications to potentially appoint a new acting U.S. attorney there, but the interim appointment of Trump's current pick expires next month. Finding a qualified candidate who is willing to lead the U.S. Attorney's Office could be a tall order while the Trump administration insists on keeping Halligan in the role, according to two former managers in the Alexandria office who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they did not want to damage relationship with judges and prosecutors. Although the position is prestigious, any U.S. attorneys in the district would be risking blowback if they applied for the top job while Halligan remains in the office, the two people said. Few attorneys in private practice would want to risk their livelihoods under those circumstances, they said. Justice Department leaders signaled Tuesday that the Trump administration would likely attempt to fire any replacement for Halligan named by the court. It's not likely. It's guaranteed that the president gets to pick his U.S. attorneys, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said in a social media post. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the business section. Stocks slide after Trump threatens new tariffs over Greenland. The fear trade is absolutely on right now, one analyst says, as U.S. and European markets slump and Wall Street's fear gauge spikes. By Aaron Gregg. Stocks took a beating Tuesday as President Donald Trump's push to annex Greenland stirred up new trade tensions that spilled into global markets. The sell-off accelerated throughout the trading day, with the S&P 500 index shedding 143.15 points, or 2.1%, to close at 6,796. The tech-heavy NASDAQ slumped 561 points, or 2.4%, to end at 22,954. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average tumbled 870 points, or nearly 1.8%, to settle at 48,488. The trade-induced volatility came after Trump on Saturday threatened new tariffs on countries that oppose U.S. efforts to acquire Greenland. As global leaders met in Davos, Switzerland, Trump unleashed early morning social media posts Tuesday and threatened to impose a steep levy on French wine and champagne, adding to broader concerns about his demand for U.S. control of the Danish territory. The fear trade is absolutely on right now, said D.C.-based investment analyst Michael Farr, calling the White House's pressure on Greenland unprecedented. The CBOE Volatility Index, known as Wall Street's fear gauge, surged 31%. The dollar lost nearly 1%, and Treasury bond prices dropped, signs of decreased confidence in U.S. markets. Meanwhile, investors sought refuge in gold, a safe haven asset, which moved up 3.7% to roughly $4,765 per troy ounce. Silver soared past $94, up 6.8%. International markets suffered too. European stocks sank, with indexes tied to Britain, Germany, and France, each falling between 1% and 2% before recovering somewhat. The downturn in European stocks comes after Trump threatened over the weekend to impose 25% tariffs on 8 European nations, including Denmark, Norway, Germany, and Britain, unless they acquiesce to his demand that the U.S. acquire Greenland. On Monday night, Trump sounded off on social media. He bashed Britain for handing over sovereignty to the island of Diego Garcia, the site of a U.S. military base and the largest of the Chagos Islands. Britain in 2024 said it would cede sovereignty over the archipelago to Mauritius, with the U.S. and Britain retaining operational control of the base. He also threatened France with a 200% tariffs on wine and champagne after French President Emmanuel Macron declined to join Trump's Board of Peace, which is being billed as an international peace-building organization. A permanent seat on the board would cost nations $1 billion. Although the timeline for these tariffs is unclear, several European winemakers sold off. LVMH, the Paris-based luxury goods conglomerate that owns Hennessy, Dom Perignon, and Moet and Chandon, sank 6.1% Tuesday. It remains to be seen how Europe will respond and what that will mean for U.S. markets and the economy. Chief among investors' fears is that a European Union policy known as the Anti-Coercion Instrument, also called Europe's bazooka, could impose steep tariffs on U.S. companies. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent brushed off those concerns in a television interview Tuesday. Well, having worked with the Europeans, my guess is their next move will be to form a working group. The dreaded European Working Group, he said on CNBC's Squawk Box. Markets were unsettled in Asia too, as Japan's Nikkei 225 sank 1.1% and bond prices dropped there. China's stocks largely held up as trade tensions focused on Europe. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index, which tracks a number of companies on the Chinese mainland, had fallen by a meager 0.3% by mid-morning Tuesday. Analysts gave a mixed outlook for equity markets in 2026. Commisera Wealth Management Chief Investment Officer Eric Thiel said he sees more storm clouds on the horizon, especially given how high stock valuations were at the end of 2025. Markets this year have been disrupted by geopolitical disturbances, once again calling into question where the effective tariff rate will fall, while the closely watched midterm elections could also bring uncertainty. None of those factors bode particularly well for robust market gains, Thiel said in a note to investors, as he recommended that investors diversify their holdings and play defense. Still, others believe that trade tensions could settle down. The level of volatility remains far lower than it was last April, when the Trump administration squared off in a trade dispute with China. And the Supreme Court is still considering whether the administration's reciprocity tariffs are legal, a decision that could refund billions to U.S. companies depending on the outcome. Some investors have grown accustomed to tariff-related uncertainty over the past year. Since April 2025, we have seen repeated tariff threats and counter-threats that ultimately have proven to be the opening bids in negotiations that have brought compromise, said Paul Christopher, head of global investment strategy at Wells Fargo. The tech sector, whose speculative investment timelines mean it tends to fare the worst in a sell-off, could also offset losses in other areas. Wedbush Managing Director Dan Ives, a longtime booster of tech stocks, said he believes last year's artificial intelligence-driven rally could continue to buoy markets, with Tuesday's slump representing a buying opportunity. Our view is, just like over the last year, the bark will be worse than the bite on this issue, and tariff threats as negotiations take place and tensions ultimately calm down between Trump and EU leaders, Ives said in an email. From the economic policy section, Trump's IRS chief reorganizes tax agency days before filing season. Frank Bisignano, who leads both the IRS and Social Security Administration, said the tax agency must move more aggressively to try new technology. By Jacob Bogegi. The Internal Revenue Service will reorganize its senior ranks days before this year's filing season opens and try to use technology to become more efficient, the Trump administration's IRS leader Frank Bisignano told the Washington Post on Tuesday. Administration officials named Bisignano the IRS's chief executive, a role that does not formally exist in the agency's governing structure, in October. He also serves as the commissioner of the Social Security Administration, which means he manages more than 120,000 employees responsible for collecting roughly $5 trillion in annual revenue and dispersing close to $1.5 trillion in benefits. Before Bisignano arrived at the IRS, the agency went through 6 leaders: Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent still retains the title of acting IRS commissioner and saw more than 25,000 employees leave through layoffs, buyouts, and retirements. The agency had seen an influx of $80 billion from the Biden administration's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Congress has since revoked more than half of those funds. Bisignano said the tax service was well positioned ahead of the coming filing season, but needed to more aggressively lean into technology, including initiatives pushed by the now defunct U.S. DOGE service to reduce staffing. We're constantly investing in new technology. We constantly must reap the rewards of it, and quite often we don't, because someone isn't willing to let go of those two people, he said. I'm not at all feeling that we don't have enough staff. I think it's just the way people think that is obsolete. The first year of Trump's term shook the foundations of the IRS. To search for benefits fraud, DOGE operatives attempted to gain access to a confidential database that held detailed tax information on every person, business, and nonprofit in the country. DOGE eventually was granted anonymized access to the system. Bessent signed an agreement with Homeland Security Secretary Kristi L. Noem to share sensitive tax information on individuals the Trump administration suspected of being in the country illegally. In November, a federal judge blocked the arrangement, holding that it violated taxpayers' right to privacy. Bisignano on Tuesday unveiled a new leadership team at the agency that will see 16 C-suite executives report to him, including a new chief of criminal investigations and the IRS's acting chief counsel. The agency will jettison its former standards that measured and tracked performance on taxpayer helplines. Bisignano said previous metrics that tracked access to customer assistance representatives were opaque and distracted from the agency's mission of helping solve taxpayers' problems. Instead, it will gauge average speed of answer at call centers, call abandonment rate, and time spent on the line, he said. At the heart of this vision is a digital-first taxpayer experience, complemented by a strong human touch wherever it is needed, Bisignano wrote in an all-staff memo reviewed by the Post. The IRS will continue to work on 2 DOGE-era initiatives for this filing season, which begins January 26. The agency will pursue a shortcut to connect dozens of disparate internal data systems, ditching a Biden-era plan to overhaul much of its legacy technological mainframe. The agency will also outsource some of its paper return processing operations, including using private contractors to scan and digitize tax returns. The IRS has long been burdened by paper processing. Hard copy returns make up a fraction of the agency's correspondence, but they take exponentially longer to process than returns filed electronically. DOGE officials had pitched fully privatizing those initiatives. Bisignano said the IRS would have a hybrid public-private digitalization process, saying he was wary of outsourcing too much of that work. I'm fundamentally DOGE, Bisignano said, and what I've meant by that is I've driven efficiency and quality my whole career. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the Europe section, morally acceptable for U.S. troops to dissipate orders, Archbishop says. Timothy P. Broglio, who heads the Catholic Archdiocese for the U.S. military, expressed concern at President Donald Trump's threats to seize Greenland by force. By Adela Suleiman, Anthony Fayola, and Matthew Hay Brown. As the Trump administration intervenes in Venezuela, readies troops for a possible deployment to Minnesota, and threatens to seize Greenland, the Catholic Archbishop for the U.S. Armed Forces said it would be morally acceptable for troops to disobey orders that violated their conscience. Archbishop Timothy P. Broglio is among a chorus of Catholic leaders questioning the administration's use of force. His comments also underscored the mounting concern being voiced by the first American pontiff, Pope Leo XIV, as well as his top cardinals in the United States, over the Trump administration's foreign policy. Greenland is a territory of Denmark, Broglio told the BBC on Sunday. It does not seem really reasonable that the United States would attack and occupy a friendly nation. Asked whether he was worried about the military personnel in his pastoral care, Broglio replied, "I'm obviously worried because they could be put in a situation where they're being ordered to do something which is morally questionable. It would be very difficult for a soldier or marine or sailor to by himself disobey an order," he said. But strictly speaking, he or she would be within the realm of their own conscience. It would be morally acceptable to disobey that order. But that's perhaps putting that individual in an untenable situation, and that's my concern. As head of the DC-based Archdiocese for the Military Services, USA, Broglio oversees the chaplains who serve Catholics and others at U.S. military bases, veteran affairs healthcare facilities, and diplomatic missions worldwide. A former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Ohio native is seen as a church conservative. As the Obama administration was ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he spoke against allowing LGBT troops to serve openly. When the Trump administration disqualified transgender people from serving in the military, Broglio said that sexual orientation and gender identity issues reflected an incorrect societal attitude. He also criticized military strikes on boats the administration says are smuggling drugs. U.S. forces have killed at least 115 people in more than 30 such strikes in international waters in the Caribbean and the Pacific since September. In the fight against drugs, the end never justifies the means, Broglio said in a statement last month. No one can ever be ordered to commit an immoral act, and even those suspected of committing a crime are entitled to due process under the law. The Archbishop issued the statement after the Washington Post reported that commanders in the first known boat strike saw survivors and ordered a second barrage to kill them. He did not refer specifically to the incident, but appeared to allude to it. As the moral principle forbidding the intentional killing of non-combatants is inviolable, he said, it would be an illegal and immoral order to kill deliberately survivors on a vessel who pose no immediate lethal threat to our armed forces. Trump is set to arrive Wednesday in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, at which European leaders plan to discuss his demand to seize and annex Greenland, a demand that has transformed the annual gathering of the world's political and financial elite into an emergency diplomatic summit. Members of the military take an oath to the Constitution, not to the President. They swear an oath of enlistment to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, and obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me, according to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They have an obligation not to follow manifestly unlawful orders, but such situations are rare and legally fraught, the Post has reported. Military personnel can be court-martialed for failing to obey lawful orders. The Pentagon in November announced an investigation into Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat, Arizona, a prominent Trump critic and combat veteran, after he spoke in a video with 5 other Democrats reminding U.S. service members of their duty under military law to disobey illegal orders. The move was criticized by Trump at the time as seditious behavior, and the other lawmakers said this month that they were now also under investigation for the video. Kelly filed a lawsuit this month seeking to reverse Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's letter of censure and offer to potentially demote him in rank. Broglio's comments echoed concerns expressed in a joint statement Monday by the 3 highest-ranking U.S. Catholic archbishops, who warned that a resurgence in the use or threat of military force, including by the United States in Venezuela and Greenland, had thrown the moral foundation for America's actions in the world into question. The events in Venezuela, Ukraine, and Greenland have raised basic questions about the use of military force and the meaning of peace, wrote Cardinals Blaise Kupik of Chicago, Robert McElroy of D.C., and Joseph Tobin of Newark. In the days after the U.S. operation in Venezuela to capture Nicolas Maduro, and after Trump said he was now in charge of that nation, the Pope insisted on respect for Venezuela's sovereignty. In a January 9 meeting with diplomats in Vatican City, Leo decried a new era in which he said multilateralism is being replaced by a zeal for war, and peace is sought through weapons as a condition for asserting one's own dominion. He did not name the United States. Broglio, in his comment on the U.S. boat strikes, invoked just war theory. In Catholic teaching, the defense use of military force against an aggressor may be legitimate as a final resort under strict criteria. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the damage inflicted by the aggressor must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of stopping it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success, and the action must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the Opinion section by George F. Will. Greenland, Minnesota, Army-Navy game. Another day, another emergency. Greenland isn't about national security. It's about a president's fragile ego, as usual. The effect of power and publicity on all men is the aggravation of self, a sort of tumor that ends by killing the victim's sympathies, a diseased appetite like a passion for drink or perverted tastes. One can scarcely use expressions too strong to describe the violence of egotism it stimulates. By Henry Adams, from The Education of Henry Adams. Trying to imagine the unimaginable is a useful mental calisthenic. So suppose Vladimir Putin faced this choice. Could he assuage his fury about the Soviet Union's disintegration by conquering Ukraine? Or he could destroy the cause of that collapse, NATO. Now imagine that he might not need to choose, because of the American president's obsession with seizing a possession of Denmark. Averse to using a scalpel when there is a machete at hand, the president threatens Greenland with military conquest if Denmark will not sell the island. Were Congress to refuse funds for this purchase, he would declare a national emergency and repurpose money appropriated for other uses. Using chest-thumping mob speak, he says, "If we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way." If NATO, history's most successful collective security instrument, perishes, he might consider that a bonus. The president probably agrees with the wit who said that the trouble with facts is that there are so many of them, such as the U.S. military already uses Greenland under existing agreements, and more expansive uses are negotiable. After all, Danish blood has been shed in Iraq and Afghanistan in solidarity with U.S. forces. Danes seem to like America, despite the president's effort to cure them of this eccentricity. The U.S. military was involved with Greenland long before. In 1958, the USS Nautilus, the first operational nuclear submarine, cruised beneath the ice cap at the geographic North Pole. In Polar War, Submarines, Spies, and the Struggle for Power in a Melting Arctic, journalist Kenneth R. Rosen writes that in 1935, Brigadier General Billy Mitchell testified to Congress that Alaska is the most strategic place on Earth. Now, everyone is interested in the far north. India, writes Rosen, declared itself a near-Arctic state in 2021, and in 1975, C.L. Sulzberger, New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent and newspaper heir, wrote that Greenland must be regarded as covered by the Monroe Doctrine. The Arctic island nation has remained in the American security perimeter firmly ever since. It is already an American partner in all the ways that matter. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and other proximate nations would not recognize such a harebrained misapplication of the Monroe Doctrine. Neither would China or Russia, whose Arctic activities reveal intense interest in its national resources, expanding shipping lanes, and potential paths for intercontinental attacks. The U.S. military is training for Arctic missions, and the Defense Department is belatedly investing in icebreakers. As usual, today's president, coming late to the long-standing problem, but presuming his original discovery of it, has made himself the issue. His acquisitiveness regarding Greenland has nothing to do with national security and everything to do, as everything always does, with his fragile ego. He is pouting and threatening aggression because he has not received the Nobel Peace Prize. The Danes can perhaps take comfort from the fact that the president is contemplating military operations against another northern place. As this is being written, the Army is reportedly readying a potential deployment to Minnesota to quell disturbances stemming from ham-handed activities by the ludicrously and lethally militarized U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. During all this, the president has announced he will order that no other football game can be televised during the annual Army-Navy game. Although highlighting this game might stimulate military recruiting, the source of his power to decree such things is dubious. This inconvenience can, however, be magically dispelled by the wave of the presidential wand. Greenland, Minnesota, Army-Navy game. Another day, another emergency. Declare that the game serves national security. It probably does this more than possessing Greenland would, and questions of legality become irrelevant. In Winston Churchill's biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, he wrote that the Earl of Sunderland was one of those dangerous beings who have no principle of action, who do not care what is done so long as they are at the center of it, to whom bustle, excitement, intrigue are the breath of life, and whose dance from one delirium to another seems almost necessary to their sanity, or is evidence of its absence. And finally, from the body section, does rosemary oil regrow hair? Here's what experts say about the trend. Other treatments may work better at promoting hair regrowth. By Lindsay Beaver. TikTok has been abuzz with praise for rosemary oil for several years, with some users claiming it has helped with their thinning hair and led to longer, thicker locks. But when it comes to hair health, rosemary alone is unlikely to promote growth in any real way, experts said. Hair loss is biologically complex and emotionally charged, which makes it especially vulnerable to oversimplified or exaggerated claims, said Oma Agabai, an associate clinical professor of dermatology and director of multicultural dermatology and hair loss disorders at the University of California at Davis School of Medicine. Some people may experience a mild benefit, but it's not equivalent to what we see with more effective evidence-based treatments, she said. What is rosemary oil and what can it do for your hair? Rosemary oil is an essential oil extracted from the rosemary plant and is commonly used in hair care and skincare products. The reasoning is that its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects may increase blood circulation and decrease inflammation on your scalp, helping to support hair growth. Although there isn't strong scientific support for rosemary oil as a hair loss treatment, some studies suggest it may have a modest benefit for people with androgenetic alopecia, the most common form of hair loss, which includes male and female pattern hair loss. But it's not magic, said Adam Friedman, a professor and chair of dermatology at George Washington School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Androgenetic alopecia is partly driven by hormones called androgens. When levels are high or there's an increased sensitivity to an androgen called dihydrotestosterone, DHT, because of genetic and environmental factors, hair follicles can shrink, producing thinner hairs and shortening the hair growth cycle. Treatments that reduce DHT may slow pattern hair loss, and rosemary oil may have a limited ability to do that, some research suggests. In one mouse study, rosemary oil appeared to inhibit an enzyme that converts testosterone into DHT. Some research also suggests rosemary may reduce the ability of DHT to bind to androgen receptors, which is how the hormone affects hair follicles, Freeman said. But rosemary extract hasn't been proved in studies to reduce hair shedding or loss or to increase hair growth in any meaningful or reliable way, Friedman said. And there isn't any solid evidence that it can treat other forms of hair loss, such as telogen effluvium, a type of excessive hair shedding caused by stress, illness, or pregnancy. Alopecia areata, patchy hair loss related to autoimmune issues, or scarring alopecia, which causes permanent hair loss from inflammation in scar tissue, he said. Why do some people think rosemary oil promotes hair regrowth? Much of the hype stems from a 2015 randomized trial that has been shared widely on social media. It showed that a topical rosemary oil solution was as effective as 2% minoxidil, or Rogaine, which has been extensively studied and is associated with hair growth in some people, in treating androgenetic alopecia in men. Friedman and other dermatologists noted that the improvements in hair counts, how researchers measured success, were modest, and that the study lacked certain fundamental design elements expected in modern clinical trials. It had a relatively small sample size of 100 men, followed them only 6 months, and most critically, had no placebo group, making it impossible to determine whether either treatment was truly effective or if both groups experienced natural hair cycle fluctuations, Friedman said. Studies vary in terms of the purity, potency, and mixtures containing rosemary oil, making it difficult to draw firm conclusions about the efficacy of the oil, Friedman said. It may also be a matter of perceptions for those who swear by rosemary oil. The oil itself may make hair appear shinier and may help prevent breakage, resulting in the appearance of thicker hair, said Shari Lipner, a professor of clinical dermatology at Weill Cornell Medicine. Even without treatment, hair loss from common conditions such as telogen effluvium waxes and wanes, and people who start using rosemary oil as hair shedding peaks will notice that their hair recovers over several months, with or without treatment, she said. Because rosemary oil may help hair growth at least to some degree, it may be a reasonable add-on or adjunctive treatment for some people with hair loss, particularly for those who can't tolerate minoxidil. But it's not a replacement for clinically proven medical therapies, said Parati Miriani, a dermatologist and hair disorder specialist at Kaiser Permanente in Vallejo, California. Although there isn't much research recommending an ideal way to use rosemary oil for hair issues, one general method is to mix a few drops of rosemary oil with a carrier oil such as coconut or jojoba to reduce any risk of irritation and then massage it into your scalp. Rosemary oil tends to be well tolerated with minimum irritation, one literature review said about the oil in general. Are there lifestyle changes that help hair loss? Rosemary oil aside, a well-balanced diet, sleep, exercise, and stress management are important for overall and hair health, as are identifying and correcting any nutritional deficiencies that may contribute to hair loss, such as iron, zinc, vitamin D, or protein, Agabai said. Limit tight braids, ponytails, and extensions, as they can lead to another type of alopecia, traction alopecia, which causes hair loss from constant stress on the hair follicles. And treating inflammatory scalp conditions such as seborrheic dermatitis can reduce shedding, Agabai said. What works for hair regrowth? Natural products such as rosemary oil are generally recommended only as adjuvants or sidekicks to tried and true medications, Friedman said. For patterned hair loss in particular, dermatologists recommend evidence-backed treatments for hair growth such as minoxidil. Oral and topical minoxidil, or Rogaine, have been studied in large controlled trials and shown to be effective treatment for hair loss. While oral minoxidil is approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat high blood pressure, low-dose oral use for hair loss is off-label, and both low-dose oral and topical minoxidil, particularly the 5% formulation, are associated with notable hair growth in both men and women with androgenetic alopecia. Finasteride. Oral finasteride, which is approved to treat androgenetic alopecia in men, has been shown in clinical trials to increase hair count and improve overall hair appearance by reducing DHT. Spironolactone. Both oral and topical spironolactone have been studied more often in women for alopecia recovery. In clinical trials, it was more effective when used alongside other conventional treatments, such as minoxidil, rather than as a standalone therapy. Dutasteride. A more potent 5-alpha inhibitor, dutasteride, is also used off-label to treat androgenetic alopecia in men and women and has been shown in studies to reduce DHT and achieve a notable increase in hair count compared with placebo groups. Bear in mind, with both natural remedies and prescribed medications for hair loss, any gains will be lost once the treatment is stopped, experts said. Also, because these hair growth medications have other uses, minoxidil for high blood pressure, finasteride for enlarged prostates, spironolactone for fluid retention, for instance, they may interact with other drugs or cause side effects, so consult your doctor before using them to treat hair loss. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 20th issue of the Washington Post. Your reader has been Cheryl. Thank you for listening.